Hi, good afternoon. Ijaz Gilani is currently Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and the Faculty of Management Sciences at the International Islamic University in Islamabad. Last term, he was Fulbright visiting specialist to the program called Direct Access to the Muslim World, which was at Bates College. He's held numerous important positions, including special advisor to the Pakistani Prime Minister and project director of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Dean Gilani received his PhD from MIT, where he worked with the late Myron Weiner, who often spoke glowingly of Ijaz's talents. Over the years, his publications have covered nearly every aspect of political science, but his emphasis in recent years has been upon public opinion, a field in which he was clearly recognized as a world leader. In addition to being a university dean, that wasn't quite enough for him. He is currently the director of Gallup Pakistan, an organization of more than 100 full-time employees and a host of outside contractors. Most significant from the vantage point of comparative global studies, Gilani is a member of the six-person Gallup International Council, which designs and coordinates global studies of public opinion, employing the services of the Gallup organizations spread over 65 countries. Ijaz's talent for determining opinion on major issues does not at all surprise me. During 1979, we found ourselves in the city of Samarkand within what was then Soviet Uzbekistan. At the time, the consensus of the outside world was that the Islamic religion within the region had become nearly totally eradicated after a half-century of Marxist-Leninist indoctrination and suppression. I followed Ijaz around as he spoke to shopkeepers, people in the streets, in the bazaars, etc. After each conversation, I would turn and ask, what was that all about? And the answers were absolutely consistent. Islam here is vibrant, but practiced in private homes away from the gaze of the authorities. We even visited such a home. And I continue to be amazed at how he could almost instantly win the confidence of people he encountered. Further proof of this talent came soon afterwards, that is his talent for developing rapport with the local people, because Ijaz shortly thereafter asked whether my wife and I would like to visit a very old and very famous mosque, which he warned lay outside the very strictly enforced limits where tourists were permitted. With a taxi driver he had earlier contacted and my wife, who was so wrapped up that only her eyes were visible, we drove after dark through checkpoints to reach the mosque, where of course we were extended the greatest hospitality. We later returned to the hotel without incident. Now, I just learned during his present visit that this study was subsequently, that is, this adventure was subsequently published by him in a very successful article that was translated into several languages. He never bothered to send me one, of course. Now, Ijaz will speak this afternoon on global Muslim identity and the Denmark cartoon crisis. Dean Gilani.
Professor Connor, Professor Yarbrough, and dear colleagues, I can say. Professor Connor has been very generous in the introduction to me. It is indeed true. We met some 25 years or longer ago, he and his very friendly wife, and spent 2 weeks in Central Asia, at that time part of the Soviet Union, and did get a very close observation of how religion and nation and state was practiced at that particular time in the Soviet Union. I've had since then a continuing interest in politics and public opinion and how people practice religions. in different parts of the Muslim world. When Professor Connor asked me if I would come and speak here, I thought I would generally speak about the global Muslim community. And then he asked me if I would send him a title, and this happened to be February, when the cartoon crisis was on its climax. And from different parts of the Muslim world, reactions were coming in, so I thought it would be appropriate that I peg that general talk that I had planned for this on the subject, just referring to the Danish cartoon crisis. I don't think it might be appropriate for me to go into great detail into the background of the cartoon crisis. I chose that primarily as a reference point and as a peg on the global Muslim community. But we will come to that subject. It is a coincidence, however, I think a pure coincidence, that we had chosen that subject, and today happens to be the birthday of Prophet Muhammad. Actually, it is a holiday in Pakistan today and in many other parts of the Muslim world. The tradition says that the 12th of Rabiul Awwal, which is the lunar month that Muslim world observes, that Prophet Muhammad was born in the year 570 AD on this particular day. He was born, as most of you know, in the city of Mecca, a modest-sized commercial town in the desert of Arabia. He was born an orphan. Muhammad was born as an orphan. His father had died a few months prior to his birth. His mother, Amina, therefore, raised him under the patronage of his uncles. He lived a simple and honest life, and that's what he was known for, no other particular distinction, until he came to the age of 40, at which time he announced that he had been bestowed a prophethood. A prophet from God, as he said it, in the same succession as Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. And that he was honored by Allah to receive revelations in the form of Quranic verses. These revelations, which form the core of revealed knowledge in Islam, were revealed over the next 23 years. He was born in 570. At age 40, he announced the prophethood and started receiving these revelations, and the revelations continued for the next 23 years. These 23 years were very tumultuous years of his life. For the first 10 years, he faced great opposition within his hometown, and then he had to move to another city about 400 miles north of that particular city. The revelations which came in these 23 years are the Quran, as many of you would know. It's a short book. It's a short book of 114 small and large chapters. And it contains some abstract ideas, such as the creation of life, such as the creation of the universe. But a large portion of it actually deals with the life of the Prophet as he lived through those 23 years. During those 23 years, different situations were created, and under those situations, those revelations happened to him. The Quran, therefore, is very contextual in nature. It's very contextual in nature, especially in the beginning. The revelations are on the creation, but in subsequent years, it is about very mundane matters, all the way from hygiene to sexuality to business and commercial dealings to matters of war and peace and of political existence. I give this long preface in order to suggest how central the life of the Prophet is in the Islamic religion. The Islamic religion rests on these two principal sources, the Quran and the life of the Prophet. And the Quran and the life of the Prophet are highly intertwined with each other because the Quran was revealed in those 23 years. Each one of the 114 verses in the Quran generally describes the situation under which the revelation happened. And this situation often has a reference to the life and the event of the Prophet. As I would subsequently go into, that is why the context is very important in the entire Islamic religion. We will talk about that, how local contexts played an important role in the spread of the Islamic religion. But it also explains why Muslims across the world were so incensed when the honor of the Prophet was in some ways desecrated through the cartoon crisis. I thought, therefore, at this point, before I go into other details, say a little bit about what that reaction in the Muslim world was. I looked through the newspapers and media very closely during that particular week, February 4th to 7th. Actually, the week that Professor Connor had asked me to send him a title for this talk. And I found out that during those 4 days, there had been reactions from 40 countries from across the globe. So as we read through the media, these reactions were from 40 countries from across the globe, roughly 20 which had Muslim majority, and another 20 which did not have Muslim majority, but otherwise were known for it. These countries included, in the Middle East, Egypt, Syria. I have a list of names somewhere here. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Jordan, during those 4 days that I monitored. In the Central Asia, in Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Central and West Asia, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Albania, Bosnia, Croatia, in Africa, in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, in the Far East, Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, India. Also in USA, just during those 4 days, USA, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Russia, Belgium, Japan, Romania, Slovenia, Philippines, Thailand, Fiji, South Africa. I may not have been able to monitor all of them, but it did suggest the wide geographical span in which the Muslim world exists. In most of those observations that came from those countries, the theme was that the honor of the Prophet and Muslims had been violated. That was one running theme. That Muslims had been singled out because they are an easy target due to their current political and military weakness. That the act was discriminatory since a similar blasphemous act on Christian sacred symbols or Jewish sensitivities would not happen. And that despite the rhetoric, free speech was not the real issue under debate. These were what I was able to synthesize as the key themes in the statements or the protests from across the globe, the countries which I had just read out to you. The views in the European countries, however, not amongst the Muslims, but otherwise, were quite different. In Denmark, for example, when it was asked whether the newspaper should apologize for this, some 60% said that the newspaper should not apologize for this. Again, in Denmark, in an issue when it was asked whether the Prime Minister or the government of Denmark should apologize for this, which happened to be one of the demands in those demonstrations across the Muslim world or Muslim peoples elsewhere, 80% of the population in Denmark said that they should not apologize, the Prime Minister should not apologize. The cartoons had subsequently been published also in Norway initially, and later in Germany, France, Spain, Italy. Other countries like the UK and the United States debated the issue, but most of the media said that it would not publish them. However, in Germany and France and Italy, these three countries in particular, views were fairly harsh on the subject. It was that the issue is not one of whether there's been a blasphemous act, but the issue is that Muslims are too sensitive and that they should, in this particular case, learn how to live in a Western environment in which people can actually lampoon very sacred symbols as well. So the subject was quite contentious. As it continued for days, finally, the editor of the newspaper issued an apology. The apology from the Danish paper really was not an apology in the sense that it said the cartoons were quite decent expression. Nevertheless, the sentiments of the Muslims had been hurt, and therefore they were sorry that these had been published. There was something not wrong, but since it had hurt the sentiments, therefore they would like to apologize. But the address of the apology was quite interesting, and that relates directly to the subject of my presentation later also. It was a letter from the Danish newspaper saying, "Dear citizens of the Muslim world." And then the apology went on. There is obviously no citizenship of the Muslim world, nor is there a defined or specific political entity that exists in the form of a Muslim world. And yet, perhaps, in the global expression on that particular subject, it seemed as if there was a Muslim world. That in some ways itself expressed the theme of my subject, that even though there is no political entity as such of a Muslim world, even though there is no citizenship of a Muslim world, yet historically, and increasingly in the current circumstances also, there is a perception that there is a Muslim world somewhere across the globe. And that's the subject that I will take up now. And I shall take up, in addition to these two themes that I've just said, shall describe how, despite the Muslim world, there is no Muslim world either today nor historically. has there been a monolithic Muslim world. There has, however, been an evolution of Muslim communities across the globe. And that's something that I will explain, that even in its highest time, there has been no Muslim state as such that covered all the Muslim populations, or a Muslim empire as such, a monolithic Muslim empire that existed at any time in history. And yet there's a view, and there is a perception of a global Muslim community, and that's what I will try to explain as to how it evolved and emerged. It might also be appropriate at this point to just to describe currently as to what is the Muslim population across the globe. Even though Muslims are perceived as predominantly Middle Eastern or Arab, the vast majority belong to other ethnic and linguistic groups. The global Muslim population of today can be divided into several, maybe 6 geographic linguistic zones. These constitute an Arab zone, give and take some 300 million people, a Turco-Persian zone, roughly another 300 million people, a South Asian zone, another roughly 300 to 400 million people, an African, a Malay-speaking zone, again roughly 250 million people, and an African zone, and a 6th zone comprising Muslims in Europe, America, and the rest of the world. Altogether, roughly 1.5 billion people across all these zones, constituting approximately 25% of the population of the world. It is diverse by way of race, color, and languages, as is evidenced at the time of the annual Hajj at Mecca, where no single group, for those of you who might have either seen or visited or experienced that, no single group seems to stand out. It is intriguing, therefore, to trace the history of how these diverse groups came to share some commonalities and retained other differences. For indeed, it is a combination of the two, the commonalities and the differences. On some issues, such as the cartoons published by the Danish paper, there was similarity of views. This is also evidenced on a number of other issues which get globalized. Yet on numerous other issues, divisions and diversity, even hostility and hatred, define the relationship between Muslim populations. Some of this is today tapped through global polls, to which I shall come at the end of this talk. But it is interesting that the complex interaction between sublime principles and self-centered tendencies have persisted throughout the history of Islam. This conflict and tension between universalism and localism, going back all the way to the Prophet Muhammad's life. Prophet Muhammad himself belonged to an Arab tribe, which was custodian of the local deities in Mecca. When he renounced those deities, he was seen as a traitor and a transgressor from their tribal solidarity. The local leadership appealed to what one might call as the national or tribal sentiment in Mecca, and in the most difficult years of his life, boycotted him socially and economically. He looked for support, therefore, outside his tribal group and migrated to another territory some 400 miles to the north with a small group of devoted men and women to form a community that rose beyond ethnic and tribal affiliations. Every migrant, or as in Arabic is called as muhajir, fraternized with a local family which was called as the Ansar. The Prophet himself shared a small house in this new place with a local person named Ayyub Ansari. Actually, the same Ayyub Ansari, those of you who've been in Istanbul, has the center of Istanbul as the Sultan Ansari. The Turks had a special affinity to him, and that's why they named the center of Istanbul as Sultan Ansari. There's a big story behind it. But it's the same Ayyub Ansari with whom the Prophet, when he moved to this different city, stayed in his house, as all of his companions shared quarters with the local people. But the tensions between localism and globalism were soon to surface even during that time. Economic tensions cropped up between these migrants, the Muhajirs, and the local people. Political competition surfaced. A local man from the Ansar, whose name was Abdullah bin Ubay, who had hoped to be the political leader prior to Muhammad's arrival, deeply resented that he had been eclipsed by an outsider. So he tried to organize his own faction in what we would, in today's terminology, call a nativist backlash. This tension is described in the first chapter of the Quran in the manner that the Quran is today organized. As well as in some other later chapters in the Quran, in the unique and characteristic tone of the Quran, and they are referred to as the munafiqeen or the hypocrites. The tension between the Muhajirs and some groups of the Ansar continued throughout the Prophet's lifetime, but did not prevent him from forging them into a common force for moving ahead and leading a victory over Mecca and his own tribal elders from whom he had fled some 10 years ago. So while on the one hand this tension continued, on the other hand Islam continued to move on, and it continued to move on to the extent that in a matter of 10 years, the place from where the Prophet had been exiled, he returned there in a victorious position, and the former elders then gave their allegiance to him. The last sermon of the Prophet, which is commemorated each year at Hajj, contains substantial teaching on how to rise beyond narrow affiliations that, as a norm, defines the standard. At the same time, the Quran describes a sense of affiliation of Muhammad to the city of Mecca, depicting the yearning for its streets. So the element of localism is also described in the Quran, and in some of the verses which are recited very frequently, is a reference to Mecca, for whose streets Muhammad yearned while he was in exile in that other city. So localism is not something which is castigated. Instead, to a certain extent, it is recognized in the Quran itself. For all the localist tensions, Islam was now on its journey of global reach, combining at every stage what one might call as universalism and localism. In less than 100 years, it had spread far beyond in the East and the West, and broadening and deepening of its influence continued for several centuries later on. But that should not obscure the ongoing tension between the universal and the local on the one hand, and the selfish and the altruistic motivations in this forward-moving society. The famous historian, sociologist who wrote about this history some 700 years later in the 14th century owes his prominence to the fact that he could capture the duality or the complexity of that dynamic between the universal and the global, the selfish and the altruistic. And this is Ibn Khaldun, whom many of you might have read and heard about. Ibn Khaldun, who was a great empiricist, recorded the history of a large number of Islamic dynasties, of which, as I explained earlier, there was never one, there were several, of which there were many which quarreled with each other, dislodged one another, and either remained in tension or coexisted and cooperated. His generalization led him to believe that primary loyalty to one's inner circle, bound by blood and language, was the strongest instinct of human beings. The asabiya, as he called him. On the basis of cases which he documents in a very contemporary social science manner in the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun shows that empire builders put together a group with their aspiya-bound compatriots at the core and lead it to success. However, once they succeed, they wish to move ahead and bring in outside groups to both broaden their base as well as enhance their own maneuverability beyond the control of Asabiya group, which claims special privileges. Those who move ahead, this is how Ibn Khaldun goes in great detail to explain, those who move ahead generally accommodate groups beyond their original localist comrades. But the newcomers whom they bring in form their own asabiya, and hence this tension between the two tendencies continues to persist as empires become broader and larger. In a remarkable survey of shaping of global Islam, we see the story replayed in every region which I had earlier, where there are 300 million persons each. This particular story of Asabiya, bringing in other people, and the tensions of universalism and localism is a history replayed in every one of those regions, whether that's East Asia, whether that's Africa, or whether that is Central Asia, or the Middle East itself. In the Middle East, expansion to Syria, Egypt, and Persia, and what happened within the first 20 years after the death of the Prophet, created the issue of absorbing non-Arab population. The mawali, word in Arabic meaning the client, relationship with the wali or the patron, was the mechanism through which non-Arab populations were absorbed into this growing empire. A culture in which the court and the urban elite interacted, the court on the one hand and a newly emerging urban elite, resulting in the development of a courtly cosmopolitan elite and generally an urban religious elite. This dynamic in which the Muslims were moving forward, having to have absorbed other populations and developing various mechanisms for their expansion, led to a great deal of assimilation, to the extent that some scholars say that Islam became a new guise for an old civilization. It is often by scholars believed that the court system was borrowed from the Byzantines. The mysticism as it evolved was borrowed from Christianity. Rational thinking and empiricism was developed from Greek thought. And the court system and bureaucracy was also borrowed in a great deal from the Persian Empire. But in each case, it was assimilated in a manner that it subsequently began to be known as the Islamic culture rather than those original cultures from which this process of absorption had taken place. It was during this period that the schools of law also began to emerge. These schools of law, which we today know as the Hanafi school and the Shafi'i school and the Hanbali school and the Maliki school, developed during those periods, and in each case, they were the mechanisms through which customs and traditions and the needs of the time were reconciled with the principles of Islam in the Quran and the life of the Prophet as it had existed. And this became a principal mechanism in the urban areas. In the rural areas, a new institution began to develop, and that new institution was the institution of mysticism. According to most analysts, with a heavy influence of Christian mysticism in it. They are today called, and they began to be called as the Sufi brotherhoods. We see, therefore, a gradual addition to the traditional Asabiya groups as this process takes place. Lineage and neighborhood, which were the traditional bases of solidarity. To this were added first the ulama, people who belonged to the circles of those scholars, began to develop themselves amongst themselves a solidarity around those scholarly leaders. They were initially just scholars, subsequently they began to be as social leaders. And here people coming from different backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, many of them converting to Islam, people coming from different social classes, began to rally around those scholars and develop their own identity behind them. This was more of an urban phenomenon. In the rural areas, the Sufi groups or the mystic groups assumed the same position. So again, people began to affiliate themselves with various Sufi groups, and that was a new identity added to the former and traditional identities of neighborhood and of blood. Initially, the identity of the political aristocracy was defined by Islam, but subsequently it affected the popular identities also. Several layers of identities were now being shaped. The cosmopolitan aristocracy and the warriors, the urban merchants, the urban ulama and their followers, and the rural Sufis and their followers. These groups have continued to define the sub-identities in the Muslim civilization, and there is a fascinating reading of the interplay, competition, and conflict amongst them as Muslim civilization progresses through different regions in the globe. The warriors, the merchants, the ulama, and the Sufis, and people identifying themselves with any one of them. There's a very interesting travelogue by a Muslim traveler of the 14th century, whose name some of you would be familiar with, Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta in the 14th century started from Tangiers, the western end of Morocco on the Atlantic, and spent the next 40 years or so traveling all the way to the Chinese Sea. And he went from one Muslim culture to another Muslim culture, none of them bound by political authority. Every place that he went to had a different political authority. Yet he moved at great ease, as his travelogue describes, from one country to another country. He had been trained as a young lawyer in the Maliki school. And there was one thing common wherever he went, and that was the law, or the Sharia, which was practiced. So it was not a common Muslim political authority from Morocco to the Muslims living in China, but a particular cultural and civilization uniformity that existed all along this territory. The expansion of Islam, therefore, was not an expansion in clear political terms. It was much more an expansion as a civilization, generally in the form of small local communities. And those small local communities, bound by, the term today has become quite popular, bound by Sharia or the law. The law was developed along this period, not under state authority, but outside state authority, although the state enforced either wholly or partially that particular law. The Muslim world that we know of historically, for the most part, therefore has not been a state, nor even a single empire. That is true of today, but not only of today, the point that I wish to emphasize again, but it is also true historically, even of the period for which Islam is known as a glorious civilization. It has primarily been a shared civilization amongst groups, orthodox and unorthodox, even heretic, that interacted, competed, and quarreled. Yet there was a common bond, most prominently over shared law, the Sharia, which evolved independently of political authority, although enforced wholly or selectively by it. A large worldwide civilization emerged during a millennium starting in the 7th century, which comprised of local communities of warriors, merchants, scholars, and mystics, who were rooted locally but for most part had a global universalistic imagination inspired by Islam. So deeply rooted locally, but having generally a universalistic inspiration shared by that traveler whose name I just gave you, Ibn Battuta, who spent 40 years of his life traveling from one part of the Muslim world to another, all the way from Morocco to South China. An American biographer of him has compared him with Marco Polo. They were only about 50 years apart. And he says, I'd like to find out what was the difference between the two. The two traveled roughly the same span. And his conclusion in that biography is that while Marco Polo went and wrote about other civilizations that he visited, Ibn Battuta during the same time writes as if he is part of a single civilization throughout which he is traveling. And that showed not just Ibn Battuta, but a global imagination of the civilization as a whole. These communities, with local rooting and global imagination, were not static, however. Their ideas evolved, and their behavior changed as we look through history. Their behavior changed in a very dramatic manner, in the sense that in North Africa, particularly what is Morocco now, and subsequently Islam from there went to Spain and remained there for 800 years, was actually carried by what would today be called as a heretic group. It was an unorthodox Islamic group. An unorthodox Islamic group fled from the center of Islam, went to North Africa, but continued to propagate Islam as it believed it. Later, about 100 years later, they came back to the orthodoxy. So it changed and evolved as it moved along. However, from the 18th century through the 20th, after that first millennium that I explained, from the 7th to the 17th century, these territories faced severe decline, and colonialism and its aftermath, the post-colonial states, restricted the theater of their activities and evolution. So in the first millennium, Islamic civilization has been very dynamic with a global reach, even though there is no single state, no single empire, there is competition, there is conflict, yet it is moving ahead on a global theater. Starting the 18th century, as these territories were colonized by various European powers, that global interaction ceased. And therefore, in the 3 centuries, those 3 centuries that we generally consult, the Islamic world appears to be of a different variety. It appears to be a different variety of truncated states with not much interaction with each other, and evolution of a very different kind. As the world, however, slowly moves post-nation state, and as globalization sets in, the notion of global Muslim civilization is in an interesting way getting resurrected. It is, as in the past, a kaleidoscope of diverse, competing, and quarreling groups. Yet there are certain bonds, emotions, and behavior which put them together. It is these common emotions which appear and show up in different public opinion surveys as we conduct them today. And I thought I will bring to you at least 3 or 4 of such surveys which we carried out through the Gallup International across the globe in many countries, including Muslim countries. The first survey was on an unfortunate event of the 9/11, where large majorities, we carried out a survey a week after the 9/11 event. Large majorities considered the act to be wrong. The question of whether the attack on the World Trade Center was right or wrong. And large majorities across the Muslim countries considered it to be wrong. However, close to half, and that comes as a surprise to people in other parts of the world, close to half of the respondents, almost uniformly in the Muslim world, different countries, the respondents doubted if Osama bin Laden was responsible for that particular act. On the US military action in Afghanistan in 2002, roughly 70%, again across the Muslim countries, were opposed to the US military action in Afghanistan. It said there was not sufficient evidence for the United States to engage in military action in Afghanistan. A third survey that the Gallup International again conducted in different parts of the world, including Muslim populations, was on the military action in Iraq. Once again, large majorities were opposed to the military action and did not consider it justified. On still another issue, which is, and I understand you have a lecture in a week or so on that subject, on the issue of democracy. How is democracy viewed in the Muslim world? In this particular survey, done in some 65 countries, some of them Muslim majority, others not, 60,000 persons were interviewed, and they were also asked their religious affiliation, and some 6,000 of them across the world happened to be somewhat under their share, because in some countries surveys weren't conducted. 6,000 of them were Muslim. So I looked through the data of that particular 6,000 Muslims. They happened to be in Muslim majority areas, such as Pakistan or Turkey or Malaysia or Indonesia, also in countries such as the United States or the UK or France or Germany or Belgium. All of these countries, 1% or 2% of the population is Muslim and captured in the global surveys as such. The question was, despite all of its difficulties, democracy is the most successful political system. Do you agree or disagree? And some 70% of the Muslims across the globe agreed with that statement. Very close to the global average. Actually slightly higher than, since it was also classified by religion, by the Orthodox Christian population, perhaps for their own experience of a different kind. It was also slightly higher than those who considered themselves as Hindu by religion. Roughly similar to those who regarded themselves as Catholic Christian by religion, and 5 to 7% lower than those who described themselves as Protestant Christian by religion. It was interesting, however, in that particular survey, that another question was asked, which was, that do you think that you have your political system, you observe it, you have have free will, and the exact wording was, do you actually practice democracy? One is the norm, and the other one is the practice. And the interesting thing was that on that particular count, many of the old democracies, the figure dropped from 70 to 75% down to in the range of 35% or so. And here the difference between the Muslim populations and the non-Muslim populations was not that particularly significant. There could be a variety of explanations why that was so. Perhaps when people practice democracy, it was whether the rule is by the will of the people. When people practice democracy, their expectations go higher. When they're not practicing democracy, their expectations are lower, and therefore those who have practiced democracy for many people amongst them say that they're not being ruled by the will of the people, even though the institutions of democracy continue to function. There's a point that I wanted to come back to on the Danish cartoon crisis and these surveys. To me, as I looked through these surveys, the 9/11 survey, or the military action in Afghanistan, or the military action in Iraq, and the Muslim viewpoint worldwide, where 70% or so opposed a policy practiced by the United States. The implication of that difference and the implication of the difference on the issue of the cartoon crisis. On the first three issues, as I analyzed them, I found that within Europe and the United States, outside the Muslim world, majority Muslim world, some 50% of the populations also had similar views. So 50% of the population in the United States was opposed on all of these counts, on the Afghan issue and on the Iraqi issue. On the issue of intervention in Iraq, the opposition in Germany actually was higher than the opposition in the Muslim world on an average. The opposition in France was roughly comparable. The opposition in Spain and Portugal was higher. The opposition in Argentina was also higher than the average in the Muslim world on the issue of intervention in Iraq. And so the global Muslim population was in a worldwide company. On the cartoon issue, it was different. On the cartoon issue, the Muslim world had one opinion, very skewed in one direction. And the world outside that Muslim world, as we describe it, was skewed in the other direction. And hence, in the times to come, I think as globalization progresses, we will continue to have these situations in which there are global crises, in which this worldwide Muslim sentiment is either in tune with the rest of the world or highly different from it. That would be one dimension to watch on what issues the view of the Muslim world as we conceive it is similar or by and large in tune with the rest of the world, and on issues on which it is highly divergent. It would also be important to say the issues on which the Muslim opinion is divided within itself and the issues on which there is wide consensus within the Muslim world. As we see it, as issues get globalized, they evoke a common Muslim reaction or perception. It may not be so on regional issues, on local issues. On regional and local issues, Muslim opinion might be highly divided within itself. But as issues get globalized, the reactions of Muslims across the world might be quite similar. And it tells us something, as globalization has different implications of a whole variety of ranges, a reality which is unfolding in front of us. That as issues which are global in nature increase, it is highly likely to evoke a common Muslim response from across the globe. And as this response, whether it is in tune with the rest of the world or in opposition, and we've had examples of both cases I explained to them, as it happens, that reaction in itself will create a worldwide Muslim consciousness. A worldwide Muslim consciousness, therefore, I think, goes hand in hand with globalization as it occurs today. And therefore, an important issue to watch along with other issues and implications of globalization. The Gallup International polls, which Professor Connor also mentioned, therefore, I think in the months and years to come, will be an interesting research instrument to us, whereby, and that is what distinguishes it from many other polls, and I'd be happy to take that up in questions and answers, is that if you just poll in the Muslim world, in many ways you do not capture the variety of Muslim opinion. Because large populations of Muslims live not in Muslim majority countries. And large numbers of Muslim populations also coexist with other religions. In fact, at the closing, if we look at the initial expansion of Islam, in the first millennium, and in particular in the first half of that millennium, Muslim coexistence with other religions was the norm. Islam expanded into Syria and Iraq and Egypt. What is the core of Islam in many ways, seen as the core of Islam, within 20 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. But it only became Muslim majority some 300 years later. So while political authority was soon to come, the conversion of the local population to Islam was an extremely slow process, and it partly explains the gradual blending of Islam with local traditions. The blending of Christian mysticism would not have come if Muslims had not lived with Christians for a long period of time. The blending of many of the Jewish traditions would also have not come if Muslims had not lived with the Jewish population for a long period of time over those centuries. It is exactly the same process in East Asia and South Asia, where Muslims lived with Hindus and Buddhists. And in East Asia in particular, the initial phase of turning to Islam was a dualistic conversion, in the sense in which people said they were Hindus and at the same time Muslims. And it continued for a fairly long time, where that dualistic existence continued. It is through other institutions we find in East Asia, in Africa, in other parts of the world, that this coexistence, but a gradual absorption. In East Asia, for example, when people from there went to the annual Hajj, they discovered that that kind of dual existence is not what is practiced in the mainstream Islam, and therefore they went back, and Islam took a different shape, again over a long period of time. So Islam's experience of living with other cultures and other religions historically has been fairly rich. It is only during the colonial period and during the nation-state system that that experience got narrowed. And in many countries, including myself, my own country, the notion appeared that you have to separate from a large country as a separate nation-state to exercise Islam. That is how Pakistan was created. While it might be true and legitimate demand for that particular period, that has not been characteristic of Islamic history. In Islamic history, Muslims have coexisted with other thoughts and other religions, and the tension between the universalism and localism explains that entire history and explains the gradual expansion of Islam into vast areas of the world. I hope that the cartoon crisis has this positive fallout in that sense, that it creates greater interest in us to understand the Muslim world as it exists across the globe, and its relationship with the rest of the world could not be as tenuous as in the cartoon crisis, but more cooperative, as has been characteristic for many parts and for many periods in Islamic history. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'll be very happy to take them. Fine. I think the event in Karachi yesterday was perhaps more an accident than a sectarian conflict. Just large numbers of people went there and there was a stampede. But there are many, many events like these of sectarian conflict. that is one point which I was trying to make. I think these differences are characteristic of the large Islamic community, historically as today. I would not think that one would expect these differences to go away. However, a better way of coexisting of these differences is what one might hope for. Islam is unlikely and I think undestined to be just one monolithic group. For 1.5 billion people across the globe, living in such diverse conditions, it is highly unlikely that there would be one monolithic group. The sectarian differences also can be both a way of strength for Islam and a way of weakness. They can be a source of strength in Islam because they do capture different kinds of people. They do capture, society has different tendencies. And as we experience in modern day democracy, it is the messiness of democracy that explains its strength. Wide variety of groups competing with each other, competing in different ways. Similarly, in the larger Muslim civilization or set of communities, there will always be differences. And I don't think we should look for removal of those differences. Instead, there should be a way of managing those differences.
In the Gallup surveys, you mentioned that the questions were asked following an event such as 9/11 or the United States military action in Afghanistan. Were these same questions asked again several, like in an interval of further amount of time afterwards to gauge if the reaction had changed, if that 70% that had, were against it, if that had changed at all to the same question but with further time apart from the event?
Yeah, I think on the Iraq issue, it was repeated some 6 months later. And the interesting thing was that in the Muslim world, views had not changed. In the rest of the world, views had changed, not dramatically reversed, but the proportions which had opposed intervention within the United States, for example, reduced. In Europe also, they got reduced by 5 percentage points, 10 percentage points. But in the Muslim world, they did not change.
In countries where the Sharia or Muslim tradition is really intertwined with the formation of government, how will they be able to overcome sectarian differences in the sense that if you believe that government is a reflection of divine will, how can you accept a government that is based on an opposing vision of divine?
These schools of law which I mentioned developed in the first 3 centuries in Islam are the 4 or 5 major schools of law. And there is enough room for those schools of law to coexist. In fact, in those legal traditions, they are not considered as contradictory of each other. And so there is room within those states to accommodate a variety of interpretations of Sharia. That's one. Secondly, during the periods that Islamic Sharia was practiced and the expansion of the Muslim civilization, political authority was much less defining of common day-to-day behavior as social authority was. I think that this is one reason, and probably one reason the debates are also coming more to the forefront. As the role of state recedes, those traditional ways of dealing with human existence will have greater possibilities. So to leave a great deal of room to different groups living in society and leaving much less of a room for the state's centralized authority is where different schools of Islamic law could coexist with greater facility. So one, historically there's been a lot of room of variety. Okay?
You mentioned the emergence of, how when you took the Muslim opinion all over the world was very similar on these various issues. Has that been the case in the past, or is it a more recent development? And secondly, I forget who it was by, but one of the readings we had for this week mentioned how there was, when Sunnis and Shias, when it was divided by sect across the Arab world, there was very different opinions. The polls you took reflect that? Was there a category for Sunni or Shia, or was it just a general Muslim category?
Historically, again, one would not know. I don't think there was similar polls conducted in the past, so we would not have any data on that. On these global issues, interestingly, there is not much difference between views of countries. The question did not include the denomination, but there is not much difference in the views of countries which have large number of Shia population and countries which do not. In Pakistan, we've had several surveys where we do ask the sectarian denomination. On some issues, there is wide difference, but on matters of foreign policy such as these, there is very little difference. So if you ask on a particular issue relating to Iran, there would be a difference of opinion. On the Iran-Iraq war, during that period, as we were asking questions then, there was a difference of opinion. But on matters such as the intervention in Afghanistan or Iraq, there is, in the Pakistani surveys, no significant difference by sectarian affiliation. And that brings me to that original point, that on global issues there is likely to be much more uniformity. On regional and local issues, perhaps greater diversity.
Matt, we'll give you the last question.
You mentioned at one point that only polling among primarily Muslim countries hides the diversity of opinion within the Muslim world, because so many Muslims live outside of the Muslim world. On these global issues, is it just that the diversity of opinion has been hidden by the polling methods, or do you really think that opinion is that highly unified even in Muslims living in Western countries?
Yeah, in a few surveys which have tried to look into this issue, for example in Africa, where Nigeria or Kenya or Uganda have substantial Muslim populations, but they are not the majorities, and there are substantial populations of other religions, that on the intervention in Iraq issue, for example, the Muslim and non-Muslim views were very different. So while Muslims in Nigeria and Uganda and Kenya opposed the intervention, the Christian populations, the opposition was much less. So in a way, the surveys done by the Pew the Foundation and other surveys done specifically in the Muslim countries without really classifying the populations by Muslim and non-Muslim, and without looking at countries where Muslims are in much smaller numbers, and hide a great deal of reality. For that reality to be captured, I think it's much better to have global surveys in which then there is global classification of religions and comparing those views. Thank you very much.